He is gone.
She found the second phone on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 weeks after she had buried him. She was not looking for anything. She was doing what widows do in those first terrible weeks, going through drawers, sorting through the ordinary wreckage of a life shared with another person for 32 years, deciding what to keep and what to let go. The phone was in a shoebox at the back of his closet, underneath a pair of boots he had not worn in years. It was a prepaid phone, the kind you buy at a drugstore with cash. It was fully charged. She stood in her bedroom in the house they had built together in Charlotte, North Carolina, holding that phone in both hands, and something moved through her body that she did not have a name for yet. Not fear exactly, not grief, something older and colder than either of those things. She pressed the power button. The screen came to life, and Margaret Anne Calloway, who had loved David Calloway since she was 26 years old and believed with everything she had that he had loved her back, began to read. And the woman she had been for 32 years began, very quietly, to die. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We have viewers all across this country and we love hearing from every one of you. And if you are not yet subscribed to Fireside Tales, please hit that subscribe button right now. We release a brand new story every single week and you do not want to miss what is coming. Now let us go back to the beginning of Margaret's story, because to understand what she found, you first have to understand what she thought she had. Her name was Margaret Anne Calloway. She was 60 years old, a retired high school English teacher from Charlotte, North Carolina. With a warm house in a quiet neighborhood, 2 grown children she was fiercely proud of, and a marriage that everyone around her described as solid, good, the real thing. She and David had met at a mutual friend's dinner party in 1991, when she was 26 and he was 28. He had been funny and attentive and had called her the next morning, which in 1991 meant something. They had dated for 2 years and married in a small ceremony in her mother's backyard in the spring of 1993. They had built a life the way careful people build things, slowly and deliberately, brick by brick. He had worked in commercial real estate for 3 decades. She had taught literature to teenagers who needed someone to tell them that stories mattered. They had raised a son named Daniel and a daughter named Claire. They had weathered hard years and lean years and the particular seasons of quiet that long marriages move through. They had grown older together in the way Margaret had always believed 2 people could, with grace, with humor, with the deep comfort of knowing that the person beside you in bed every night was exactly who they appeared to be. David Calloway died of a heart attack on a Saturday morning in September 2023. He was 61 years old. He was in the kitchen making coffee when it happened. Margaret was upstairs. By the time she came downstairs, he was already on the floor and the coffee was still brewing, and the paramedics told her later that it had been very fast, that he would not have suffered, that there was nothing she could have done. She held his hand in the ambulance. She identified his body. She called her children. She stood in a funeral home 3 days later and chose a casket while her daughter held her arm and her son stood beside her looking at the floor with the particular stricken expression of a man who does not yet know how to carry the size of what has happened. Margaret organized the service and received the condolences and thanked every person who brought food to her house and wrote every single thank you note by hand, because David would have expected that. She did all of it in the careful, controlled way of a woman who is holding herself together by the sheer force of her own dignity. She did not fall apart in front of anyone. She had decided she would fall apart later, privately, when the business of grief was done. The business of grief led her to his closet on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the funeral. She had not been able to open that closet since he died. His clothes still smelled like him, and she was not ready for that to change. But her daughter had gently suggested that going through his things might help, and Margaret had decided that Tuesday was the day. She started with his shirts. She moved to his suits. She worked her way methodically toward the back of the closet the way she did everything, steadily, without rushing. The shoebox was on the floor in the far corner underneath the unworn boots. She almost did not open it. She almost left it for another day. She has said since that she thinks about that moment often. The moment before she opened it. The last moment of the life she thought she had. The prepaid phone had 47 saved contact names. Every single one of them was a woman's name. Not a colleague's name. Not a client's name. A first name only, the way you save the number of someone you do not want your spouse to find. Margaret sat down on the floor of the closet with the phone in her lap and she began to go through the messages. She did not allow herself to stop. She read for 4 hours sitting on that closet floor. What she found across those 47 contacts was a pattern so consistent and so deliberate that it stopped feeling like betrayal and started feeling like architecture. David Calloway had been maintaining simultaneous intimate relationships with multiple women for at least 11 years. She found messages going back to 2012. She found financial transfers, small enough individually not to draw attention, made to several of these women over years. She found hotel reservation confirmations. She found photographs. She found a thread with a woman named Sandra that went back 9 years and read like a relationship, a real sustained relationship, with inside jokes and shared memories and the particular shorthand of two people who know each other deeply. She found a thread with a woman named Vivian that contained a message David had sent 2 days before his heart attack that said, "I will handle it. Promise. Trust me." She did not yet know what he had promised to handle. She would find out. Margaret did not cry on the closet floor. She has said this herself and she finds it difficult to explain even now. She thinks she had already spent her grief on the man she believed she had lost and that this new man, the one on the phone, was someone she did not know and therefore did not have grief for yet. She had something else instead. Cold and absolute clarity. She stood up off that closet floor after 4 hours and she made herself a cup of tea and she sat at the kitchen table where David had collapsed 6 weeks earlier and she began to make a list. Margaret was an English teacher. She had spent 30 years teaching students that the most important thing a person can do in the face of something overwhelming is to begin. To put the first word down. So she put the first word down. She wrote at the top of a legal pad, in her neat teacher's handwriting, "What I know." And she started writing. She hired a private investigator named Thomas Garrett within the week. Thomas Garrett had been working domestic cases in the Carolinas for 22 years, and he told Margaret in their first meeting that her case was not the most complex he had encountered, but that it had elements he wanted to handle carefully. He took the prepaid phone and began cross-referencing the contacts, the financial transfers, the hotel records, and the communication patterns. What he brought back to Margaret 3 weeks later was a report that ran to 41 pages. She read it at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and her reading glasses and the same focused attention she had once given to her students' essays. When she finished, she took off her glasses and she set the report down and she looked out her kitchen window at the yard David had mowed every Saturday morning for 26 years and she thought, with a precision that surprised her, "I need to know everything. Not some of it. All of it." The 41-page report confirmed that David had maintained a sustained relationship with the woman named Sandra Briggs for 9 years. Sandra Briggs was 54 years old, a dental hygienist from Raleigh, North Carolina, who had met David at a real estate industry event in 2014. She did not know David was married. She has said this publicly and Margaret believes her. Sandra Briggs had believed she was in a committed long-distance relationship with a man who traveled extensively for work and who would eventually, when the time was right, be with her completely. David had told Sandra that he had been separated from his wife for several years and that the divorce was in its final stages. He had told her this for 9 years. Sandra Briggs found out David had died the same way she had found out everything else about his real life, from a stranger. A mutual acquaintance had seen the obituary and sent it to her. The obituary listed David's wife of 32 years, Margaret Anne Calloway, and his 2 children. Sandra Briggs had sat in her car in the parking lot of the dental office where she worked and she had read that obituary 3 times. Then she had gone inside and seen her patients and driven home and not spoken to anyone for 2 days. Thomas Garrett's report also confirmed the message Margaret had found from David to the woman named Vivian. Vivian Marsh was 49 years old, a paralegal from Greensboro, North Carolina. Her relationship with David had been shorter, approximately 2 years, and it had a different quality than the relationship with Sandra. Where Sandra had been kept in a sustained deception about David's availability, Vivian had known he was married. She had not known his wife's name or where he lived, but she had known he had a family. The thing David had promised to handle in his last message to Vivian was money. He had borrowed $18,000 from Vivian Marsh over the course of their 2-year relationship, always with promises of repayment that never came. When David died, Vivian was left with $18,000 in personal loans to a man whose estate she had no legal claim to and whose family she had never met. Margaret found out about Vivian and the $18,000 from Thomas Garrett's report. She sat with that information for several days. She thought about what it meant. She thought about what David had promised to handle and had not handled and now never would handle because he had died on a Saturday morning while the coffee was still brewing. She thought about Vivian Marsh, 49 years old, a paralegal from Greensboro, who was sitting with an $18,000 loss and no recourse, and the particular humiliation of a woman who had known she was involved with a married man and had done it anyway and now had nothing to show for it but debt and shame. Margaret is honest about what she felt toward Vivian in those early days. She felt anger. She felt the very human and understandable anger of a betrayed wife toward the woman who had known and participated. She held that anger for a while, and then she put it down. Not because she was a saint, but because she was a realist and she understood that Vivian Marsh was not the architect of what had happened to her. David was the architect. Vivian was just another person he had used. She thought about contacting Vivian Marsh for 3 weeks before she did it. She is honest about that delay. She understood her own anger well enough to know that she needed to sit with it until it became something she could carry without letting it drive. She did not write Vivian a letter the way she had written Sandra. She is not sure she could have found the words for that, not yet, not with Vivian. Instead, she called. On a Wednesday evening in late January, she sat at her kitchen table with Thomas Garrett's report open in front of her, and she dialed the number. She did not rehearse what she was going to say. She had decided that rehearsing would make it a performance, and she did not want it to be a performance. She wanted it to be true. Vivian Marsh answered on the 3rd ring. There was a pause when Margaret said her name, a pause long enough that Margaret thought the call might end there. It did not. Vivian said, "I wondered if you would ever call." Margaret said, "I wondered too." That was how it began. The conversation was nothing like the one with Sandra. Sandra had been a woman in grief, soft and undone and reaching toward Margaret across her own shock and loss. Vivian was different. Vivian was guarded and precise in the way of someone who had already spent months preparing for exactly this moment and was not going to be caught without her footing. She did not apologize immediately. She did not cry. She said she understood that Margaret had every reason to hate her and that she was not going to ask her not to. Margaret told her she had not called to deliver hatred. She had called because she wanted to understand and because she believed she had the right to ask her questions directly. Vivian said, "Go ahead." Margaret asked her how it had started. Vivian told her. A work conference in Greensboro in the fall of 2021. David had been charming and attentive and had not hidden the fact that he was married, which Vivian said she had told herself at the time meant he was at least honest, which she understood now was one of the more elaborate ways she had talked herself into something she already knew was wrong. Margaret listened without interrupting. She had taught teenagers for 30 years, and she knew that the most important skill in any difficult conversation is the ability to let the other person finish their sentence. She asked about the money. Vivian went quiet for a moment. Then she said that David had come to her the second time with what had seemed like a straightforward situation, a short-term cash problem related to a real estate deal that had not closed on schedule, and that he had been so specific about it, so detailed, with documents she had looked at but not had verified, that she had believed him. The first loan was $4,000. Came back within 6 weeks with a small amount of interest. She had lent him money 3 more times after that. The amounts had grown. The repayments had stopped. By the time she understood what was happening, she was in $14,000 beyond that first $4,000, and David was sending her messages that said, "I will handle it. Promise. Trust me." Margaret asked her if she had loved him. There was a long silence. Then Vivian said, "I thought I did. I think now that I loved the person he was performing for me, which is not the same thing, but it felt the same from the inside." Margaret recognized that sentence immediately. She had been thinking a version of it herself for months without being able to find those exact words for it. She wrote it down on the legal pad in front of her while Vivian was still talking. The call lasted just under an hour. It did not end warmly exactly, but it ended honestly, which Margaret has said she valued more. Before they hung up, Vivian said something that Margaret has returned to since. She said, "I want you to know that I have thought about you every day since I found out. Not about what I owe you, though I know I owe you something I cannot repay. Just about you. About what it must have been like to find that phone." Margaret did not respond to that right away. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "It was the worst morning of my life. And then I got up off the floor." Vivian said, "I know. I read the obituary. You were described as devoted. I have thought about that word a lot." Margaret said, "So have I." Then she said goodbye and she hung up and she sat in her kitchen for a long time without moving. In January of 2024, Margaret Anne Calloway did something that almost no one in her situation does. She reached out to Sandra Briggs. Not through Thomas Garrett. Not through an attorney. She wrote Sandra a letter by hand, on the good stationery she kept in her desk drawer, and she mailed it to the address in Thomas Garrett's report. She introduced herself. She said she understood that Sandra had not known the truth and that she was not writing to assign blame. She said she was writing because she believed that two women who had been deceived by the same man deserved to know the truth from each other rather than from a report or a rumor. She said she did not require anything from Sandra in return. She said she simply wanted Sandra to know that she existed, and that she was real, and that she was sorry for Sandra's loss too. Even as complicated as that sentence was to write. She signed it Margaret. Sandra Briggs called her 3 days after receiving the letter. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Margaret has said it was one of the most difficult and one of the most necessary conversations she has ever had. Two women on opposite ends of a telephone line, both of them deceived, both of them grieving something that turned out not to be what they thought it was, talking to each other across the wreckage of a man who had never, in the end, fully belonged to either of them. Sandra cried. Margaret did not on that call. She has said she had decided before she picked up the phone that she was going to hold the space for Sandra's grief rather than her own because she thought that was what the moment required. Afterward, she sat in her quiet house and she allowed herself to cry for a long time. Not for David. For the 32 years she had given in good faith to a life that had been, in ways she was still discovering, a performance. She retained a family law attorney in February of 2024 to review David's estate. What the attorney found confirmed what Thomas Garrett's financial analysis had suggested. Over 11 years, David had moved approximately $230,000 out of joint accounts and investment accounts through a series of small transfers carefully designed to remain below the threshold that would generate automatic bank notifications. The money had been used to fund the parallel life, hotels, gifts, dinners, the $18,000 borrowed from Vivian, and a significant portion that remained simply unaccounted for. $230,000. Margaret and David had spent 32 years building their financial life together. He had spent 11 of those years quietly taking it apart. The legal process of recovering assets from an estate in cases of marital financial misconduct is slow and complicated and expensive, and the outcomes are never guaranteed. Margaret's attorney was honest with her about all of that. Margaret told her attorney to proceed. She said she was not doing it because she needed the money, though she did need some of it. She was doing it because she had spent 32 years being an honest person in that marriage, and she was not going to allow the last chapter of it to be the chapter where she said nothing and accepted everything. She was 60 years old. She had decades ahead of her, and she was going to begin them standing up straight. This is a moment to pause and speak directly to every woman watching this. Because what happened to Margaret Calloway is not a story about a uniquely monstrous man. It is a story about what happens when someone who is supposed to be your partner decides that their own desires and their own comfort are worth more than your dignity and your trust and your future. And it is a story about what a woman can do when she finds out. Margaret did not disappear. She did not collapse. She did not allow shame, which was not hers to carry, to silence her. She got the phone records. She hired the investigator. She wrote the letter. She retained the attorney. She told her children the truth. She did every hard thing in the right order with the full force of a woman who had spent 60 years becoming exactly who she was. And if you are sitting somewhere watching this and something in Margaret's story has landed close to home, we want you to stay with us until the very end. And if you have not yet subscribed to Fireside Tales, do it right now. Because next week's story is one you absolutely cannot miss. Hit that subscribe button and we will see you there. By the spring of 2024, Margaret had begun telling her story to people outside her immediate family. She told her closest friend first, a woman named Loretta who had known her since their children were in elementary school together. And Loretta's response was to sit with her for an entire afternoon without trying to fix anything, which Margaret has said was exactly right. She told her book club in April, not because she owed them the information, but because these were women she had known for 15 years, and she did not want to spend the next 15 years carrying a secret that was not her fault. The book club's response was the kind of response that reminds a person why long female friendships are one of the most sustaining forces in a human life. They were angry on her behalf. They were present. They did not offer opinions about David or about what Margaret should feel. They just showed up. Every week for the rest of that spring they showed up. Her son Daniel found out in November. Margaret told him herself because she believed he had the right to know and because she did not want him to find out from anyone else. She had prepared for that conversation carefully the way she prepared for everything. She had thought through what she needed to say and how she needed to say it and what she was and was not prepared to discuss. Daniel listened. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he asked his mother what she needed from him. Margaret told him she needed him to understand that she was going to handle this herself and that she needed him to trust her to do that. Daniel is 31 years old and was raised by a woman who spent 30 years teaching young people that their own resources were greater than they believed. He said he trusted her. He kept his word. Her daughter Claire found out in December, 1 week before Christmas. Claire's response was different from her brother's. Claire cried, and then she became furious, and then she cried again, and then she said things about her father that Margaret asked her gently to hold on to for now because grief and rage sometimes say things that the quieter, longer truth cannot sustain. Margaret held her daughter in her kitchen for a long time that evening. She thought about the fact that Claire had loved her father completely, and that this information had not erased that love but had complicated it in a way that would take years to fully understand. She thought about how grief is hard enough when it is clean, and how almost nothing about grief is ever truly clean. Margaret's legal process concluded in the fall of 2024 with a settlement from David's estate that recovered approximately $140,000 of the $230,000 that had been transferred. It was not everything. It was something. Her attorney said it was a strong outcome given the circumstances. Margaret thanked her and wrote her a check and went home and sat in her kitchen and thought about what she wanted the next chapter of her life to look like. She was 61 years old by then. Her house was paid for. Her children were healthy. She had her pension and her recovered settlement and a very clear understanding, hard-won and permanent, of exactly who she was and what she was capable of. She started writing in January of 2025. Not a blog. Not a public account of what had happened. Something private first, a document for herself, a record of the year she had just lived through written in the careful, precise prose of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching other people how language works. She wrote about the closet and the phone and the 4 hours on the floor. She wrote about Thomas Garrett and his 41-page report. She wrote about the letter to Sandra and the 2-hour phone call. She wrote about telling Daniel and holding Claire and sitting across from her attorney while the numbers were laid out on a conference room table. She wrote about all of it because she is an English teacher and she understands that writing a thing down is how a person begins to own it rather than being owned by it. Her therapist, who she began seeing in November of 2023 and has continued seeing every 2 weeks since, told her something in one of their early sessions that Margaret has returned to many times in the months that followed. The therapist said, "The life you thought you had was real. Your love was real. Your effort was real. Your 32 years were real. The fact that he was not who you believed him to be does not retroactively erase your reality. It only adds to it. It only makes you someone who loved honestly in a situation that did not deserve that love. And that is not a failure. That is a kind of courage most people never have to demonstrate. Margaret wrote that down in the document she was keeping. She has read it back to herself on the days when the anger and the grief arrive together, which still happens, which she says will probably always happen to some degree, which she has made her peace with. There are things Margaret Calloway knows now that she did not know before. She knows that a person can love someone genuinely and be deceived by that same person completely, and that both of those things can be true at the same time without one canceling the other. She knows that the impulse to protect the image of someone you loved, even after they have hurt you, is one of the most human impulses that exists and also one of the most dangerous, because it is the impulse that keeps women silent when they should be speaking. She knows that the shame of being deceived belongs to the person who did the deceiving and not to the person who was deceived, even though the world often tries to arrange it the other way. She knows that 60 years old is not the end of anything. She knows that a woman who has spent 32 years being a devoted wife and mother and teacher has resources inside her that most people, including sometimes herself, have not yet fully seen. She also knows something smaller and more specific that she wants every woman watching this to carry with them. She knows that the prepaid phone in the shoebox at the back of the closet is not always a phone. Sometimes it is a separate email account. Sometimes it is a P.O. box. Sometimes it is the money that has been quietly leaving the joint account for years in amounts too small to notice individually but devastating when you finally add them up. She is not telling you to become suspicious of your partner. She is telling you to know your own financial life, to have your name on the accounts, to understand where the money is, to not outsource the knowledge of your own financial reality to another person, no matter how much you love them and no matter how much you trust them, because love and trust are not the same as information, and information is what protects you when love turns out to have been something other than what you believed. Margaret Anne Calloway still lives in the house in Charlotte. She has repainted 2 of the rooms in colors she chose herself. She has started a garden in the backyard, in the space where David used to park his car, and she has planted yellow roses because she has always loved yellow roses, and somehow in 32 years she never got around to planting them. She is writing something longer now, not the private document, but something she is beginning to think might eventually be read by other people. She is not sure yet what it is exactly. She is an English teacher. She knows that you do not always know what a thing is until you have written enough of it to see its shape. She goes to therapy every 2 weeks. She has dinner with Loretta every Thursday. She talks to Daniel every Sunday and to Claire every few days, and she is watching her children learn, the way children always do eventually, that their parents were human beings with complicated interior lives that existed before their children arrived and will continue in some form even after everything changes. She is not over it. She is honest about that. She does not believe over it is the destination. She believes through it is the destination, and that through it is not a place you arrive at once, but a place you keep moving toward, a little more each month, a little more each season, until the morning comes when you wake up and the first thing you think about is not him and what he did, but the yellow roses and what they are doing and whether they need water. She says that morning has not come yet. She says she believes it will. If this story reached something inside you today, please share it with a woman you love. Share it with your sister. Share it with your friend. Share it with the woman in your life who you sense is carrying something she has not yet been able to name. Because sometimes the most important thing a story can do is make someone feel less alone inside the thing they are living through. And if you are not yet part of the Fireside Tales family, subscribe right now. We are here every single week with stories of real women and real courage and real truth. Stories that matter. Stories that stay with you. We will see you in the next one.